the book is an attempt to kind of take you on these different journeys, and it's really, in a sense, a kind of a different way of telling history. That so much of the history that we tell is centered around, kind of presidential figures, great political leaders, military conflicts, large social movements, and this is really a history of the world through the lens of these ideas and these technologies and these breakthroughs and the often crazy people who set them in motion in the world, and all these unintended consequences. And it goes back quite a long way. So there's a chapter, actually the opening chapter, is on glass, on the importance of the material glass. If you could basically somehow wave a magic wand and remove glass from the last 1,000 years of human history, it would radically change just about everything in society. You would eliminate not just the obvious things like windows and glasses for our clean drinking water, but spectacles, the lenses in our microscopes and our telescopes that have enabled so much of the scientific revolution. You would eliminate all the lenses in all our cameras and our television screens, and of course on our phones, and the fiber optic cables that connect the internet. The internet on some fundamental level is made of glass. And so we don't even think about it. It's become such a kind of a natural part of our world that we don't think of it as a technology, but it really actually was a technology. In the beginning of the 1200s, 1300s, some of the most advanced kind of technologists in the world were glassmakers. And one of the stories that I thought was so striking, that's one of my favorite ones in the book, is the story that actually involves Gutenberg, who I think most of us feel like we have a pretty good read on Gutenberg, right? That he invents the printing press, and that changes everything. Probably the single biggest communications revolution of the last millennium. And we know this story that people start to read, and that triggers revolutions in science and in theology and in art and pornography. I mean, all these things happen because of printed books and because of a literate population for the first time. But there's a kind of an unsung story here, a hummingbird effect story, that almost never gets talked about, which is that once the book got into circulation in European society, it had an interesting secondary effect. Well, all of a sudden, all these people who were reading for the first time suddenly said, I can't read this, I need glasses. I'm farsighted. And as we see so often in these situations, it was in a sense a problem that didn't exist as a problem until books came along to make it a problem. So people were farsighted all along. There was a certain percentage of the population, particularly those that lived long enough to be 40, which was unusual, who couldn't read books, but they never had to read books. In fact, the original spectacles were invented by monks because they were the only part of the population that was doing reading in the first place. So all of a sudden, with the introduction of spectacles, a demand begins with the introduction of books to read, and then this need for spectacles. This sends out a kind of a signal, like a market signal throughout Europe, that there's this sudden demand for lens makers. People can manipulate glass into these lenses to make these spectacles. And because of that, suddenly Europe is filled with these kind of pools of expertise about manipulating light through these lenses. And because people like to tinker with their inventions and mess around with them, people start saying, hey, if I took these two lenses and put them together, I could get a telescope. And if I put them this way, I could get a microscope. And almost immediately, Galileo takes a telescope and sees the moons of Jupiter and revolutionizes astronomy, and thus, on some level, theology.